Well, a very good evening to those of you joining in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, and possibly somewhere from somewhere else that we're not sure about, but a very good evening to you all. Welcome to this third in the series of webinars that we at Independent Audit are presenting to companies, organizations in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia. The first webinar we did a few weeks ago was about making virtual board meetings more effective. And the second one was about board evaluation and how that might be changing in the COVID-19 pandemic scenario. Phil Baldwin, who's based in Hong Kong, will introduce himself shortly, but if you would like copies of those webinars, Phil will arrange for you to get hold of those recordings. But today, in this third webinar, we're talking about how audit and risk issues have changed in the context of the pandemic. So Sarah, would you like to just move to the next slide? We're just going, so speaking to you this morning, for those of you who have not joined previous webinars, my name is Richard Sheath. I was founder director of Independent Audit Limited 18 years ago, and I have extensive experience of conducting many different board reviews for many different organizations over the past 18 years or so, including for some very large FTSE companies, many financial institutions, and other non-listed entities. Phil, would you like to just introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you everybody for joining us. I've been with Independent Audit since June last year. I've been in Asia for about 30 years. I'm on my 32nd year of my 2-year trip around the world, I think. Currently based in Hong Kong. Prior to joining Independent Audit, I ran a governance professional body here in Hong Kong for about 10 years. I founded an international body called CSIA that represents about 80,000 governance professionals globally. And immediately prior to joining Independent Audit, I was a director of a software as a service company providing board portal services to companies across Asia. So governance has been a big part of my life for about 20 years, particularly board governance. So, yes.
Thanks,
so
Phil.
having said that, right, just having said that, I was just going to say, this one is very much on audit and risk, and that is very much in your skill set, Richard. So I'm going to be talking a lot less on this one than I would do in normal ones. So I'm going to hand this over to you and let you talk about audit and risk in today's very challenging environment.
Okay, very good. Sarah, next slide, please. So just before we dive into audit and risk issues, just a few bits of information on Independent Audit for those of you who do not know us. We are one of the UK's leading board evaluation and governance and effectiveness review companies. Over the years, we've done way more than 350 board effectiveness reviews, and over 50 of those have been for FTSE 100 companies. We do two types of board evaluation. One is based around interviews and observing meetings and reviewing board papers or variations of those, but it's all around interviews. That's the most intensive approach. But we also have an online questionnaire system called Thinking Board, which is a self-assessment tool, but usually we provide consulting services around that so that your evaluation can become independently, externally facilitated as well. So that's most of the work we do, but we also do reviews, deep dive reviews of committees. We also look at the effectiveness of internal audit, the external audit process, risk culture, risk governance. So therefore across a whole range of different aspects of the governance framework. A lot of our clients are based in the UK, but not all. We have a lot of clients elsewhere in Europe, and now are keen to start working with organisations in the Asia region. We have offices in London, Brussels and Dublin, and Phil is there as our representative in the region based in Hong Kong. Thanks, Sarah. So those of you who are familiar with Independent Audit will know that we use cartoons in a lot of our material, in our thinking, because we like to think that even though governance is, of course, a very serious subject, we like to think that maybe there is a funny side or a humorous side to some aspects of governance. So you'll see a lot of cartoons when you start having more contact with us and receiving our information. We try to make them topical. So we're looking at this one, which is all about root cause analysis in the pandemic situation. And we'll be talking a little bit about that later in the webinar. But what we want to discuss really are 4 different aspects. One is what has changed in the COVID-19 environment. Secondly, what needs to change around evaluating the risks. Thirdly, how is mitigation changing? And fourthly, what's changing around getting assurance over risk and control in this environment. So, of course, this is very relevant for audit committees and risk committees. So what we'll be talking about is mainly looking at it from the point of view of what they or the board itself need to do differently. Next slide, please, Sarah. So firstly, what's changed in this COVID-19 environment? Well, of course, a lot. We don't want to list all of what's changed, but in terms of specifically around risk management, control, and assurance, audit and risk committees now face very new demands and hazards, things that can go wrong. For example, auditors just cannot work as before. Risk managers, who often depend on talking to people and actually looking at how things, processes and the risks in processes are actually managed, can't do that in person. They're distanced from those operations and processes. So that's quite a challenge to them. And just generally travel constraints that we all know and now unfortunately having to get used to, working from home, I mean, seeing what's happening just in the same, it just isn't possible in the same way. And so much of this is really essential elements of good risk management, soft controls, and getting assurance. So what does this mean? First of all, we have to know how things have changed from what's worked before. It really requires a lot of detailed thinking, self-examination, challenge, thinking through about what has changed. It's no point in just saying, oh, we'll just start doing the same thing from home. It doesn't work like that. Secondly, there has to be a much heavier emphasis on the risk and control culture. Whereas before, various control, risk management, assurance mechanisms, be it at the first line of defense, at the operational management level, the second line of defense in terms of the overall control structures, and the third line of defense in terms of the independent assurance. So much of that depended on well-established processes, oversight, peer review, peer control, normal controls that we are so used to. And some of that has now just is no longer possible in the same way. So therefore, management, boards, audit and risk committees have to depend much more on the strength of the risk and control culture prevailing, of course, across the whole organization. And that's the big challenge. And what all this means is that very different questioning styles and different techniques are needed in this new environment. Next slide, please. So first of all, let's think about what needs to happen around evaluating the risks. These are the sort of questions that need to be asked or angles that need to be considered. Firstly, a board, as well as a risk and audit risk committee, for example, need to stand back and say, and really ask themselves, challenge themselves and challenge management about how have the risks around the business model and each category of risk actually changed. We know that COVID is affecting virtually every aspect of an organization's operations and processes. So therefore, that implies that surely the risk profile will be changing across those as well, whether they be internal changes or external changes as the third parties, the other organizations, the customers, the suppliers, all of the parties that we interact with as an organization are similarly affected. So management need to help the board stand back and say, look at the risk profile, look at the principal risks, and say, where do we stand today? And where do we think this is actually going? And how has that changed both our gross risk exposure, that is before mitigation, and our net risk exposure, that is after risk mitigation? Second point, health and safety needs to be top priority now for everybody, every organization. Of course, for many organizations, particularly in extractive or heavy industry, it has always been a top priority. But now, got to look internally at the potential risks for staff welfare, health exposure, exposure to customers. And so this has really shifted, and the way in which the organization evaluates those risks and evaluates the effectiveness of the mitigation needs to be looked at differently. And that is a board level responsibility. Health and safety is a responsibility of all directors, and that cannot be avoided. So a board should be looking for a new risk assessment, broken down by each core operational process and supply line, whether this be in a service industry, a financial institution, a manufacturing organization, you name it, any type of organization, you need to look at each process and supply line, and for the essential, vital processes, this should be coming up to the board and to the risk committee and or audit committee to understand how those fundamental risks have changed. Working from home introduces new risks. The soft controls that I mentioned earlier that normally apply in an office environment may well now be absent. Obviously, the systems controls hopefully are under control as people are using VPN and actually plugging into standard systems, and therefore the controls around those are in place. But it's more softer controls with use of multiple devices, working in environments where other people have access to very confidential information, sensitive information, potentially, if it's not locked away or kept under control. They may even be overhearing confidential discussions, board meetings, etc. There's many different aspects to that. And a board, as well as being used to looking at cyber risks and other IT-related risks, now needs to extend it to thinking through how exposed are we around that very sensitive corporate information, but also personal data. The consequences of the protection of personal data need to be carefully thought through now that people are working from home. Fifthly, looking at the non-process, what I call the non-process risks. A board may not have spent much time in the past looking at certain aspects of legal, HR, welfare, customer conduct. These, of course, have changed. Yeah. Customers are in a very different situation. How you treat your customers and customer outcomes may need to be quite different. Your staff are facing different issues, welfare issues, different situations at home, potentially financial pressures. What is being stored up in terms of legal risks, in terms of customer claims, or potentially even staff claims against the organization? So a lot of those non-process risks, as I call them, which are operational risks, but possibly more qualitative in nature, need to be considered more carefully. Third-party risks. Again, it's an area where boards, if I generalize, are not particularly strong in understanding the nature of third-party risks, particularly around cyber risk. That must also change. They need to look much more carefully around outsourcing, contractors, and any other third-party and joint venture related risks, because those organizations themselves, of course, have been dramatically affected by COVID-19. And of course, the risks have changed for them. So that implies the risk of change for us too in working with them. And then the next point is this question of the impact on the risk culture. I won't repeat what I said before, but just highlighting that different parts of the organization, the culture may be under pressure in different ways. We all know that different parts of the world are being affected to different extents. The government responses have been quite different. And so different parts of the operations worldwide, or even just within a particular region, or potentially even within a country, may be affected in different ways. And therefore, the risk culture and the pressures on the control culture might actually be quite different. So it's that looking at breaking it down, looking at it by country or office by office, has always been important because cultures differ, but now it's even more important. So it's important that the board looks at it evaluates these risks, not only the cultural risks, but all of these risks by country and by business unit. That is not a fully comprehensive list, but it's long already. So that gives you a feel for the way in which a board and a risk committee or audit committee, in supporting the board in the area of risk, needs to really take a different approach. What that means in practice is different considerations being covered in risk papers. It would be a mistake if the risk management function or the executive continue to just provide the same risk papers to the board, to the committees, without putting it in the context of COVID-19. It also means changing the risk part of the board and committee agendas to make sure there is enough time to consider how things are changed. And that needs to happen regularly across all meetings going forward, because as we all know, the situation is changing constantly. So just doing it once and then thinking you can come back to it in a few months' time is not going to be enough. Sarah, next slide, please. So what this means then is that, of course, the mitigation of those risks also needs to change. So firstly, having identified which of the significant risks have changed, of course, the follow-up question needs to be to ask management how each significantly different risk is now being managed. You have to look to the management to actually explain how they will know that what has changed in their mitigation approach is actually working. And then also be looking at how the risk culture that is supporting those risk management approaches is providing the strong foundations for those risk management approaches by making sure the behaviors have changed, how knowing that they are in place, the right behaviors are in place. So it's no use just having a session at the board or the committee on how the risks have changed. Of course, you then have to say, well, management, how have you changed your approach to managing those risks? And how do you know that those changes are working? You might be satisfied that the risk management processes, risk management framework has been working for business as usual before the pandemic, but we know so much has changed. How do you know it's working now? Present us with an explanation and present us with the evidence. So in practical terms, this means creating some space in the agenda, particularly in the audit committee agenda, if the audit committee is responsible for overseeing risk management, or of course, in the risk committee agenda, if you have a separate board risk committee. The important thing is to create the space. That could well mean longer meetings, it may mean more frequent meetings, or at the very minimum, it's likely to mean changing the priorities so that enough time is given to these pandemic-related changes. Also, it means hearing directly from risk owners and first line of defence managers. It's no use just relying on the head of risk management or on the head of internal audit. You need to hear directly from those risk owners who are responsible for the risk management processes, so they understand the significance of the changes and the importance of keeping the board well informed on how the risk management framework is being adapted and the effectiveness of those changes. Also, the papers need to be different. I touched on this earlier, but just to repeat, what you should be looking at doing is including a COVID-specific management opinion in the papers. Too often, when we look at board papers or committee papers, we see a lot of information and data, but not enough analysis, not enough management opinion in the papers to help the board understand the nature of the issue, the nature of the risk. Now, more than ever, management needs to be stating in their papers upfront what they feel is the current exposure, what they feel is really needed, how they think the risk management is working, what do they really believe are the future exposures, the significant future exposures. The board wants to hear directly from management, and the first step in doing that is to make sure it is explicit in the papers. And then the last point is looking at, in judging the effectiveness of the new risk management approach, looking at the impact, not just the process. What I mean by that is management may well explain how a risk management or control process has been changed in response to the new risk environment. But is that really actually having an impact at the operational level? Is it having the intended impact? And so a process may look good on paper and it may sound good in being explained. And management may be following that process through very effectively, but it doesn't automatically mean that it's having the target impact. So a committee needs to be looking as well as, is it actually having the effect that we intended? So again, not fully comprehensive, but there are a few aspects of mitigation that need to be considered in this changing environment. Sarah, next slide, please. The last area I want to talk about is assurance. This is, of course, another area where what happened before, just in practical terms, isn't possible. As we all know, internal audit traditionally sends out teams. They go out into the field, they talk to people, they understand processes, they hear about the controls, they look for evidence, not only spoken evidence in those explanations, but also documentary evidence that controls are actually working. But usually they do that in the field. Of course, they cannot travel. So now they're having to look at evidence online, from home, most likely. They can't talk to people without face-to-face. They can talk to them, of course, online, through video, and of course that helps a lot. But it's not the same as sitting in front of somebody and what we call applying the smell test. Can you sense that what you're being told is right? It's not the same as looking somebody in the eye when they tell you what they do. So something different, so it's a very different working environment for the auditors. And so that means new techniques. So an audit committee needs to be working out with internal audit how their plans and their approach will be adjusted, both in terms of how the plan, the audit focus is being adjusted to the new risk profile, but also how their audit approach is being adapted. For example, in terms of obtaining evidence in order to support the internal audit work and findings and recommendations. And so the nature of the evidence may well be different. And so the committee needs to understand that. And on significant audit points, and those red and possibly amber audit points, the audit committee needs to look carefully at what is the evidence here and understand from internal audit how they've supported their view, and also have that discussion with the management affected by that to make sure that they recognise and accept the way in which the evidence on which the internal audit point is being based. We'll also be looking at opportunities for softer assurance, and again this comes back to the culture point. Our internal audit actually looking at the behavioural aspects of processes and controls in order to get some extra assurance from the way people are behaving and their attitudes. Of course, external audit is also affected. Again, we're used to external audit teams going out into the field, auditing on site. That isn't going to happen in the same way. So the reporting risks, that means that the audit approach needs to be different, and the audit committee needs to understand that. But also what's changed is the reporting risks. As we're all fully appreciating, the impact on businesses, organizations has been huge. And so that is affecting things such as provisioning, valuations, revenue recognition, all these different aspects of conventional reporting risks, which now have a very different angle and probably much less certainty around them. So different judgments are having to be formed. So what this means for audit committees is that firstly, the forward agenda needs to be adjusted in order to allow for early discussion of critical reporting risks. The last thing anybody wants is to be a month before year end and suddenly start talking about some of these potentially very major hits on the balance sheet, on the P&L, and that's just leaving it too late. So the discussion needs to be anticipated and start having the discussion early with management and with the auditors so that these critical reporting risks can be considered in good time, and possibly allowing enough time also for adjustments to the audit process or management processes in order to anticipate the difficulties that might be coming later. So the audit committee also needs to be understanding how the auditors are adjusting the audit process and their plan, so that the audit committee is satisfied that the audit process is still going to be effective despite the constraints. And then also, when it comes to assessing the significant judgments in the accounts, the audit committee needs to be allowing possibly a lot more time than they did before, because it's just going to be much more complicated. It's going to be much less certain, and it's going to be more difficult for everybody involved. That just means more time is needed. And also, the non-audit committee members of the board are probably going to be even more worried than usual. Of course, they will still have confidence in their audit committee colleagues, but they will need to know how the audit committee has responded to all these different changes and risks. Because overall, of course, all directors ultimately have responsibility for the quality of the accounts. So the audit committee is going to have to really think through how it gives their fellow directors on the board the confidence they need. And just lastly, risk management and compliance, other parts of the second line, they also face obstacles, of course, in the way that they're working in a distanced, working from home way. And so obviously it depends how each part of that risk management compliance or other forms of controls such as environmental control, health and safety, etc. They will be affected slightly in different ways. So the audit committee or the risk committee needs to work out with the second line how they are actually going about assessing and supporting the control environment, the risk management framework in this context. Again, they need to hear from them how they're tackling the risk culture question. And again, how are they, as the second line, reporting to the committee and to the board? How are they capturing COVID-19 angles, the changing risk environment, the changing assurance environment, the changing cultural environment? How are they capturing all of that in the way they report to the committee and ultimately possibly to the board itself? So, as you can see from that quick run through these different aspects, so much has changed around audit and risk, and those changes are going to be with us for a long time to come. So an audit committee, a risk committee, a board that is thinking that not a lot has changed and we're just going to work through things pretty much as we did before, they're probably not in the right place and they're not in the right mindset. A lot has changed, they need to change as well. So if you'd just like to go to that final closing slide.
Just before you move on, Richard, I think obviously, as you said, in many cases, the eyes-on scenario is no longer possible. But I would like to sort of just mention sometimes organisations, I mean, the Pentagon is a classic one where they're often accused of planning for the last war. And a lot of companies will have got in frameworks now for sort of operating under COVID-19 and assessing the risk, or if they haven't got them, they're very close to get them. But they've also got to perhaps get those frameworks for the next crisis that they perhaps haven't thought of. And that's something that they may need outside sort of people to come in and give them fresh ideas and fresh perspectives on what's coming out there. I know in Asia there's a lot going on now, and everybody's probably thinking about the sort of trade war between the US or the West perhaps and China, but on a macro scale. And also the legal risks, on the legal risk side of things, legal risk is now very international. It's no longer local and is becoming more international as we speak. And a good example of that is the national security legislation we've just had in Hong Kong. That are now applied, that is very ambiguous legislation, and that applies to anybody who is a citizen of China or permanent resident of Hong Kong. If you're giving analyst briefings in New York or London, you can still have, you're still subject to that law, and very ambiguous law. And if you say something about admiration of Taiwanese nationhood and therefore are deemed to threaten the singularity of the PRC, you could actually be in trouble personally, but also put your company very much in trouble as well. So when you're looking at the broader risk, that's something you've got to think about, because legislation now, particularly for countries, in countries that are ruled by law rather than rule of law, is becoming perhaps more ambiguous and wide and broader in its interpretation. And you've really got to think about that. And that's something a lot of people in Hong Kong, for example, are thinking about and taking very seriously now.
Yeah, but thankfully, it's suddenly the whole environment is suddenly so much more complex, and as you say, in certain countries and outside of those countries, even more complex too, with the external political changes that we're surrounded by. So Sarah, if you could just move on to that last slide, and then actually we'll move into Q&A. So there you've got some contact details. We'll be providing those to you after the webinar. But if we could just close our presentation down and just go full screen. Hopefully some of you might have already been using the Q&A facility. But if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have got several questions already. So just picking up on that. First question coming through. Do you think audit committees and risk committees need to be spending more time given the changes? Yeah, I mean, I've touched on this a bit in the presentation. I think it's unavoidable. That might mean, and it probably does mean, more meetings for audit committees and risk committees. For audit committees, particularly as you get into the reporting season for those with calendar year end, or actually for any time over the next 6 months, any year-end reporting, it's unavoidable that a lot more thinking, a lot more discussion, a lot more debates, a lot more understanding of judgments, a lot more hearing from the auditors, a lot more hearing from management are going to be needed. A lot more time is needed on internal audit issues. It's just unavoidable. So either audit committees need to get longer, which is not something that I particularly like the idea of, because they're already very long and there's a limit to what can be an effective meeting, especially when it's a virtual meeting. So what that means, therefore, is more meetings. I think it's unavoidable, but also it's possibly more possible than it was before, because with virtual meetings and without the travel requirements, it's actually easier for people to schedule additional meetings. So I think it's not unreasonable to ask audit committee members to attend more meetings, possibly make the meetings that are scheduled shorter and more effective, but certainly I think they possibly need to be more frequent. And also, just remember, because they're virtual meetings, they don't have to be tied into the timing of the board meeting. Yeah. Traditionally, as you know, people often, because people are traveling to board meetings, committee meetings are often scheduled either on the same day or the day before as board meetings. That doesn't have to happen. So again, really think through the scheduling, really think through what time will be required to make sure that nothing on the audit committee agenda gets neglected. And yeah, I'm sorry to say, I think that does just mean more time, more meetings.
And should the risk committees, audit committees, sort of be a little bit humble and recognise if they don't have the skill set to bring in outside people where they need to bring them in? Don't be shy about doing that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, audit committees generally are quite accustomed to inviting in either people internally or external advisors, and it may be that a bit more of that is needed. So a practical example of that will be obviously hearing from the external auditors how other companies might be dealing with different risks that they're facing around the reporting, or what might be happening in terms of disclosures. So more time might be needed to listen to the external auditors. I wouldn't necessarily say for an audit committee it's going to be anybody particularly new who's invited into the committee. For a risk committee, that might well be different. You might need to hear much more from, for example, the general counsel or the legal function in the risk committee than you have before. It might, where you've got outsourced providers, you might actually need to hear a bit more from them. If it's significant. So yeah, I think you need to look carefully at who you need to involve so that you're hearing directly from people.
Okay.
So have you got another question coming through? Yeah, this question here, does this mean more interaction between the board and certain members of the assurance framework, so the first, second, third line of defense? Particularly, does it mean more interaction between, yeah, that's what it's saying, head of internal audit and the chief risk officer? I think that's probably true. Obviously, you can't expect a board to want to spend a lot of time inviting in new people, such as the head of internal audit, and having them in large parts of the board meeting. And outside the financial services sector, it's unusual to have the chief risk officer involved directly in the board meeting. But I think in this particular circumstance, as the board agenda changes and the risks that we talked about, the COVID-19 related risks and the evaluation of those are discussed at the board level, it will make sense to have, for example, the head of internal audit and or the chief risk officer that's coming into the board and speaking directly to the whole board, rather than just speaking to the committees. So obviously you can't apply a certain rule to that, but I think there are benefits to it.
Okay. And what do you suggest boards or committees do to get a better look at the overall risk culture?
It's tricky, this area, because obviously, as we talked about, culture varies across organizations. And it's an area that, as boards have been increasingly expected pre-pandemic to get a better picture of the culture across the organization, boards have been trying to think through what to do. And it is difficult because it's quite an intangible, what I call a slippery subject. What we suggest boards do is mainly use two things. One is not possible at the moment. That is getting out into the organization and actually seeing, getting a feel for how things are working by visiting a branch, visiting a call center, visiting a mine site, visiting a factory. Of course, that's not realistic, and trying to do that online through video is not going to achieve the same in terms of getting the feel for the culture. So you need to look at other indicators. So what we suggest to boards is not trying to create some form of measurement of risk culture or organizational culture, but using existing indicators, because many indicators exist already. They don't need recreating or creating from scratch. So if you think about it, you've got a lot of data coming out of staff surveys. You've got compliance data. You've got customer feedback, probably supplier feedback, other third-party feedback. You've got HR indicators, turnover statistics, possibly leaver interviews, training statistics, things like that, which indicate whether or not an organization is happy, basically, or what attitudes are. We've also got a lot of funds coming out of internal audit, possibly out of risk management. You've got audit findings. You've got other measures, for example, in relation to IT failure or IT user issues. So I could go on, there's a long list of things that you could use. And often these things, if they're looked at by the board at all, are looked at in their silos. So audit findings are looked at in the audit committee in the audit report. Compliance issues or conduct issues are looked at in the compliance report. HR, which often doesn't feature very heavily on board agendas anyway, those statistics probably, they may reach the board in a paper, on one of the papers, but rarely are they discussed. So either these indicators are discussed in their own silos or not discussed at all. So what we recommend is that the board tries to get a picture by actually pulling these indicators together and looking at them through the lens of culture, asking the question, okay, what are these trends and changes in the indicators telling us about the culture of our organization? Yeah. And so just by representing existing indicators, a new picture can be presented, which isn't going to be perfect. It's a bit like a jigsaw with holes, with pieces missing. Of course, it's not going to be perfect, but it does give the board more information, a better insight. And importantly, it gives the board a basis, an opportunity to discuss the culture. And it will prompt thinking, it will provoke questions, and that's at least a start. So once the board can get into that sort of pattern on a regular basis of having those discussions based on a regular picture, then I think that certainly is a good starting point. And in the absence of being able to perform site visits, it's an even more important report and discussion to be had.
Okay.
Very good. Well, we've come to the end of our time, so I'm just going to pass over to, well, thank you for your participation. It's been good to, what do you describe it? It's good to see you, I don't know. But anyway, it's good to have you involved in our webinar. Hopefully you'll be able to join us in a few weeks' time, but Phil will touch on that shortly. So I'll say goodbye and just hand over to Phil to close the webinar.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was actually very interesting and very useful, I think. And thank you everybody for participating in our webinar. I hope you and trust you found it useful. Our next one is scheduled for Wednesday, the 12th of August at 4 p.m. in Hong Kong, Malaysia and Singapore. And that's all about looking to the future, how the board focus will change. We did touch on that a little bit today because it's going to change dramatically going forward, I think. So in the meantime, please register for that. We'll send it out soon. We'll also send out the video of this, or the link to the video of this webinar so you can go back through it if you're so inclined. In the meantime, if you'd like to discuss your board evaluation options, please contact me. The details are on this, will be sent to you by this, by email, I believe, also on this webinar. So thank you very much, and we'll see you on the 12th of August. Goodbye.
I hope so. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care. Stay safe. Bye now.
Bye.